Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. You're currently viewing Digital Equity for Indian Country, hosted by the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and Amarin Critical Infrastructure. My name is Davida Delmar. Davida Delmar Asia, Bipatoin Nishlan, Do Kintlachine Bashing, Kia Ani Dashe, Do Torachine Dashnella. Welcome, everyone. Really excited about our webinar today. We have EJ John from the American Indian Policy Institute to tell us more about their work and just general initiatives about digital equity for Indian country. We're excited just to have him here and to learn from his insight. A little bit about our work real quick. So the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and Amarin Critical Infrastructure currently have a partnership, and through a grant program called the National Digital Navigator Core. So if you want to learn more, you can visit our website if you like. So that's why I'm here, kind of the bridge between the two entities. And part of that work too is we, this month, if you're paying attention to Native American issues and the work that we're doing here at NDIA, we also released a blog that features a digital navigator from the Cherokee Nation. It's called Building Connections, How Cherokee Nation's Digital Navigator is Bringing Digital Skills to Every Corner of the Reservation. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to put it in the chat if they could, as well as thank you, NDNC. And yes, so some other initiatives going on. So if you're interested, tomorrow we're making a big announcement at our NDIA community call. So if you're part of an affiliate group, we're going to make the announcement there, but don't worry if you're not, because we're going to feature it on our website and our blogs. And so there's more to come in terms of how we are advocating and amplifying the work of folks doing digital inclusion work in Indian country. Finally, if you haven't heard, we have a working group called the Indigenous Digital Inclusion Working Group. It's hosted by me. We meet monthly, so it's usually the first Wednesday of every month. We record it too, so if you miss it, you can always come back and let me know, and watch the recording. So it's easy to join that working group. You just email me and you just say, I want to be part of your working group, and I'll add you. So really excited to see and hear from a lot of different people in our body of practitioners or folks who are doing this great work. And anyone working in the space or related to this space of digital equity and inclusion is more than welcome to come. So yes, so without further ado, real quick, actually, a couple of housekeeping. So of course, I'm going to introduce EJ. He's going to go through his presentation. There's a Q&A function. So if you have a question, please put it in that realm right there. We'd love to hear more questions and things like that. We'll answer them at the end of his presentation. But if you have any thoughts and things like that that you want to share in the Q&A, it's also welcome as well. So yes, and then also, of course, if you have any questions for me and the work that we're doing at NDIA Amarin, we're always here too. You can always email me as well. So with that being said, and without further ado, so EJ John is a Senior Policy Analyst for the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University. EJ is the American Indian Policy Institute's, or AIPI, Policy and Research Analyst, and a citizen of the Navajo Nation from Vander Wagon, New Mexico. He received his JD from the University of New Mexico School of Law in 2016, and prior to that, EJ received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of New Mexico. His interest in law and policy came from his time interning in the DC office of Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico in 2011 as an undergrad. Before coming to AIPI, EJ worked on the tribal government reform and development with the Office of Navajo Government and Development. So I'm also a citizen of the Navajo Nation, so it's really great to, see my brother EJ here giving his, knowledge on all the great stuff. So I'm going to pass it over to him.
Thank you. Thanks, Davida. And thank you to everyone for joining this presentation today. Really excited to speak with you all. So let me pull up my slides here. Okay. So yeah, again, thanks for that introduction. I'm part of the American Indian Policy Institute and going to talk to you all about digital equity in Indian country today. So just a little background information about the American Indian Policy Institute. We are a research institute out of the Arizona State University. We recently joined the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law here at ASU. So we are located within the School of Law, which is in the downtown Phoenix campus, if you all are interested in visiting us. But we are a research institute that focuses on tribal policy. Um, the AIPI has been around since, I believe it was established in 2006. And since 2006, AIPI has kind of focused on different areas of policy. There has been work done for environmental, sustainability kind of issues, as well as economic development. But right now, under our current director, Dr. Tracy Morris, we've been really focusing on telecommunications and broadband. And that's one of Dr. Morris's areas of expertise. So you might have seen her in some other presentations. So she leads our institute. Again, there's me. A little bit about my background. I come from a small community in New Mexico called Vanderwagen, which is located on Navajo Nation tribal land, and it's a fairly rural area. It's 20 minutes from the nearest town, but we still face a lot of issues that a lot of rural communities face, small rural communities face. Um, and I think David already covered all the qualifications, so we can go through that. So yeah, let's go into an intro to tribal nations, because in order to kind of understand any issue that takes place in tribal communities, whether that's broadband or access to healthcare or infrastructure development, like a lot of them kind of share the same core issues, core challenges, you could say. So some demographic information. Within the US, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. Um, what it means when you say federally recognized tribes, or these are tribes that have some kind of law or statute or even a treaty with the United States that recognize these groups of indigenous peoples as their own sovereign entities that kind of have the ability to govern their own jurisdictions. So there's 574 of those in the United States. There are other groups of indigenous peoples in the United States who may have state recognition or might not have any kind of official recognition, but they are still groups that are recognized to be indigenous and have been here for since time immemorial. So those are out there. Out of the US population, according to the 2020 census, Native Americans make about 6% of the total population, which was a jump from the 2010 census. I don't remember how big of a jump it was, but it was pretty significant. Here in the United States, there's about 100 million acres that are under tribal control, under control of tribal nations. It's not necessarily like control that you would think of like a state or a county where they kind of like have total say of what happens to that land, but it's kind of like these tribes are, for the most part, kind of get to decide how to use the lands that are assigned to them. And those land designations kind of are called, some of them are called reservations, some of them are called like just, trust lands. They have different names, but they all kind of refer to the lands underneath a tribal nation's jurisdiction. So there's about 334 of those that span 35 states. Some of them are as big as the Navajo Nation, which has a land area that's roughly the size of West Virginia. Some are small as a few acres that maybe cover like a school or maybe a cemetery or a small plot of land. So they definitely vary in size. Median age of Native Americans is about 31.5, which is significantly lower than the US average, which is 37. Median income, according to the census, was about 46,000, which is a lot lower than the median income of the rest of the US. Here in Arizona, where we're located, we have 22 federally recognized tribes. And out of those 22 tribes, there's about 20 million acres here in Arizona that are under that are homes to tribal nations, which amounts to about 27% of the total land here in Arizona. And the population here from the 2020 census was about 338,000 people who identified as being Alaskan Indian or American Indian or Alaskan Native. And this is a map of Arizona and the way that our tribal land is situated. The Navajo Nation makes up the main part of the northeast corner of the state. Then you have the Hopi tribe, which is located within the Navajo Nation. And then you have other parts of Arizona where a lot of these are kind of, I wish I could overlay like where the cities and the towns and the highways and stuff are located too, because you'll see just kind of how remote a lot of these communities are. But not all of them are super remote. If you kind of look at where Gila River Indian community is located, as well as Salt River in Occoquan, like those are that's near the city of Phoenix. So they're closer to a big urban area, as well as parts of Tohono O'odham and Pasco Yaqui, which are close to Tucson. Um, but for the most part, yeah, a lot of these have a pretty remote location. Yeah. So, and the reason why I kind of want to cover all that is because let me go back to the map real quick. If I go back to what I mentioned earlier about tribes being sovereign nations, that means that these lands that are designated to be tribal communities are their own separate legal jurisdictions. These are jurisdictions that were established by federal law or they were established by a treaty with the United States. So these are determined to be places where tribal nations get to establish their own laws, their own court systems, as well as their own regulatory structure to govern their own communities. And that's super important when you talk about tribes because tribal people, Native Americans who are part of federally recognized tribes, are considered to be political entities, and being a part of the tribe is a political distinction. It's a political status that you carry with you as a member of a federally recognized tribe. And so that carries with it legal obligations. And that's kind of that those obligations vary from tribe to tribe. But I mean, it's something that is not necessarily classified in the same way as like a racial classification for other groups of minorities within the US. So that's kind of how tribes, that's the foundation of how tribes interact with the other governments around them, whether that's a state or a county or the federal government, is that there is that baseline legal status, which kind of determines what that relationship is and what the obligations from the tribal nation to another government, what those are. Yeah, okay. So because of that legal distinction and just kind of the remoteness of tribal communities, um, that leads to it kind of resulted in a lot of just overall historic challenges to development in these rural tribal communities because you have a small population that's under a different jurisdiction and just the way that things are built within the U.S. U.S. model of capitalism, as well as just kind of like government funding and support for infrastructure development. A lot of that kind of just missed a lot of tribal communities and missed a lot of Indian country. And when I say Indian country, that's the legal term that is used when people talk about tribal lands. I know like Indian is definitely an outdated term to talk about Native Americans, but I mean that's the term they use in court cases is Indian country. So when I'm talking about Indian country, I mean like the lands that are within these tribal jurisdictions. So in Indian country, it's always a high cost to develop. Anytime that you're trying to build in a remote area with rough terrain, it's going to cost more materials, and just getting the workforce and everything situated in rural areas is going to have higher costs. Um, there's just been a lack of investment over the years. So for infrastructure that really depends on private industry to kind of take over, just like telecommunications and broadband. A lot of the time, the private sector doesn't really consider Indian country as a place where their investment is going to pay off. So they're not going to invest in a lot of infrastructure for fiber. They're not going to invest in, total high quality 5G coverage and stuff like that, because it just doesn't work with the models that they use to run their corporations. So I mean, it just kind of halts at a certain point when it comes to development, for industries that use that kind of a model. Another barrier is the whole issue with tribal lands themselves, because tribal lands, while they are kind of um, designated for tribal nations, for the use of tribal nations, they're not necessarily like held. Tribal nations don't have like the deed to the lands that they are they're located in. What they do is they kind of administer the land and they get to determine how it's used. But when it comes to like owning the land or doing the the uses that people do when they own land, like they can use it for collateral, or they can approve different types of activities that go on the land. Not tribes don't necessarily have those full abilities, so the tribes have to work with the federal government, which does hold the deed, the quote unquote deed to that land, to approve, certain types of development, and to also approve whether or not that land can be used for certain uses. So that whole land into trust and not owning the land outright is a huge barrier to kind of figuring out how to develop things that are on tribal lands. And I kind of mentioned this before, but just the ruralness, the rural, the rural quality and the rough kind of terrain of a lot of tribal communities just makes it harder to develop. I mean, a lot of my home community on the Navajo Nation, we have to deal with a lot of small canyons and valleys. So when you're talking about like wireless connectivity, that's a huge issue. We don't have a line of sight to a lot of the towers that are nearby, and just there's no lines in the ground that can cover like the giant rock canyons, or cover like old washed out erosion areas and stuff like that. Like it's just not there. And to build through them, it takes not only building the infrastructure itself, but you also got to do a lot of work to kind of situate the land itself. So it's just a lot of work and a lot of money to get that kind of stuff done. Um, and then for tribal communities, there's also a huge lack of data. So for broadband specifically, we don't necessarily have data on how many people don't have broadband. We don't really know a lot about what kind of connectivity exists, and that's kind of like a nationwide problem, right? That was something that is being addressed by the FCC's broadband map. But for Indian country especially, that data is just really hard to find. A lot of the data that is collected for tribal communities is often kind of aggregated out of larger data sets. So like when you look at the census usually goes down to like census tracts, or the drawn out areas that the census uses um, to analyze your information. A lot of the times those areas are they're not granular enough to really get an accurate picture of what goes on in Indian country. So we have to kind of piece data from all these different sources, and it just kind of results in just a lack of data for not just broadband, but a lot of things like data about what do the roads look like, or what does water infrastructure look like, or what does healthcare information look like. Like it's just really hard to get that kind of data. And then the last thing that kind of is a barrier to just general development is that there are other unmet needs in a lot of tribal communities, because of just the historic lack of development that covers all areas. So there's a historic lack of water development to get water lines and running water to people. There's a lack of electricity and homes that have just basic connections to power lines. Roads are really rough. A majority of the roads on the Navajo Nation are dirt roads, gravel roads. So those are, really important needs that tribal communities got to figure out how to prioritize. And a lot of the time, broadband is not on the top of that list because people also need the basic, they need water, they need electricity. So um, those are competing needs in a lot of communities. And because tribes are their own sovereign entities, controlling what happens in their own jurisdictions for the most part, they have to kind of do all this development on their own because there's not a lot of investment from private industry, and there's also not a ton of resources made available to the federal government. Um, and the federal government does provide resources, but if they're only getting resources from the federal government, like it's not enough to cover everything that a tribal community needs. So things like housing, roads, bridges, utilities, education, healthcare facilities, all of that are these things that tribes have, for the most part, really worked to get on their own, or they partnered with other entities to get those. Same for economic development. There's because of that weird jurisdictional issues that go on when you talk about like liability for private businesses. Not a lot of businesses will consent to being located on tribal lands. So that really halts economic development for industry, like industries having to do with like kind of like storefront kind of stuff, restaurants, shops, stuff like that, but also like manufacturing, um, anything that hires like a big workforce, like that's kind of hard to get on tribal lands because of those jurisdictional issues. And but for some tribes, tribes who are able to use a lot of natural resources, maybe they do like they've got like a forestry or not a forestry, kind of like they harvest wood from forestry kind of entities, or maybe they do resource extraction like coal or gas. Tribes do have that, but it's only one source that a lot of tribes are, they want to diversify as well. So it's natural resource extraction has been one um, that has been developed, but it's kind of something that not every tribe has access to. And gaming is another resource that tribes use, but again, it's something that not a lot of tribes have access to, just because of where they're located. And then also some tribes have been been really innovative in the last couple of years, going into online businesses, going into partnering with like using their communities, maybe like local artisans to kind of export stuff from the community so that people are able to get an income from um, the crafts that they do. That's one enterprise as well. But I mean, these are all things that would be a lot better if there was internet, if there was connectivity. Um, these would help people to kind of be interact with the outside world and not have to worry about a lot of these historic barriers that have really impeded the development of like brick and mortar kind of stuff, or impeded the development of infrastructure that you need to build an office building and stuff like that. So right now, broadband access in Indian country is the biggest barrier to digital equity. Just overall access is kind of sparse. It has been getting better, but it's still way behind than surrounding communities have the access that surrounding communities are able to get. So a little bit of broadband history for tribes. The first tribe we owned telecom was the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. They were able to buy a um, telephone company in their area back in 1958. And so they established the CRST, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Telephone Authority, which is really cool. I remember hearing some people talk at other conferences and other presentations about this entity, and I think they even had a telegraph line. I remember saying that they did telegraph back then. which is pretty cool. I think that's pretty interesting. Um, but since then, there's been a few other entities who were established, tribal telecom entities have been established. I don't remember what the number is now, but I should have looked that up. But there are, there's more coming on um, every year because of the resources that are available right now. So after you get the telephone companies kind of being established throughout the 1970s, 1980s, um, we get to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was a piece of legislation that really kind of deregulated the telecom rules and regulations, and it also allowed for um, more access for like smaller companies to get into telecoms. And this was something that um, kind of changed how telecoms operated up till then, and was a huge policy development at the time. But the thing is, the Telecommunications Act of 96 didn't mention tribes. It didn't mention how tribal governments could interact in these processes to set up new telecoms. It didn't say anything about the already existing tribal telecoms. Um, and so when tribes were trying to work with this law after it passed, I mean, it was just really hard to work with. And ever since it passed, a lot of tribes and a lot of tribal telecoms have been working and advocating for consideration of tribal entities. And so you get a lot of special um, rulemakings and stuff coming out of the SEC to try to mediate a lot of that. And that kind of all resulted in the National Broadband Plan of 2010, which was one of the first federal telecom initiatives, broadband internet initiatives that started to mention tribes. It started to actually, explicitly include tribes. And part of that around the time of the National Broadband Plan, you also saw that agencies like the FCC were really taking recognition of tribes, and the FCC established the Office of Native American Affairs and Policy, called ONAP for short. So, I mean, just establishing ONAP at the FCC was a huge development and was finally like a recognition of tribal communities and just like the work that was needed to include tribes in just telecommunication and communications in general. You also saw around the time of 2010 a lot of priority windows opening up for tribes. So um, wireless spectrum is one of the resources that tribes don't have a lot of say over their tribal lands. Those are usually the spectrum access to spectrum on tribal lands is something that is usually taken up by other license holders. So in 2010, because of the advancement in wireless technology, it was kind of a really important point that tribes should have access to more spectrum over their lands. So you got a priority window, which allowed tribes to be first in line to apply for new licenses for like FM radio spectrum, to start up new FM radio stations. And then you also had a priority window to access the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is a spectrum that you can use for wireless point-to-point technology. And so as tribes were able to acquire it, I mean, it wasn't easy, it wasn't the best process, but it was still a way for tribes to start getting more access to the spectrum over their own lands. And it's still an issue today, because tribes need that access to that wireless spectrum. Because like in my area in New Mexico, because of the rough terrain, um, having lines in the ground is not really a reality in my area, because it's just so much. The cost is high, the permitting, the clearance process is just so complicated. I think the only way that my community will get reliable internet is it's got to be wireless. So the Navajo Nation in my area is definitely working to try and get access to spectrum in a lot of those areas where wireless is probably going to be the only solution. So now you get to today. In the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of funding and resources made available for not only um, broadband infrastructure development, but also for digital equity work to prepare communities for their new technologies coming in. So here's kind of just a list of some of the big programs. Some of these came out of like the CARES Act, and also the ARPA, the big COVID legislations. Um, and then you've got like the broadband connectivity program, the BEAD program, which isn't a tribal program, it's a state program, but tribes, are potentially eligible for funding from BEAD, as well as these other grant programs and other agencies. Some of these predate COVID, like programs at the USDA, and as well as some of these FCC programs kind of predate COVID. But after COVID, I mean, these programs were seen as like key programs to make sure that communities could get access at some point. Um, this seems like a lot of money, but talking with my colleagues over the last couple of years, the back in 2019, they say that um, the based on their assessment for just middle mile, enough middle mile access in the country was going to cost around 10 to 12 billion in 2019. So today, that's probably maybe double or triple that price tag, and that's just for middle mile. So if you're talking about like a need in Indian country for potentially 30 to 40 billion to provide just middle mile, these amounts, of course, are not going to cover that. So um, a lot of these programs are a good place to start. So hopefully we can continue to see resources and investment made available for tribes. The FCC's data about broadband access today on Indian country, looking at some information from 2022, you can see that they find that 88% of people in tribal areas have broadband access, and that's compared to 95% for the rest of the US for a speed of 25.3. Um, FCC data is not super accurate for tribal areas. There is like a GAO report kind of pointing out where those inconsistencies are about tribal data at the FCC. So I wouldn't say that this 88% is the most accurate representation of access. Um, we, AIPI, we did our own assessment right before COVID in 2019, and we were mainly looking at how people access the internet, and they said that they primarily access on smartphone, but we definitely didn't see an 88% access rate in our survey at 2019. So um, that, of course, that number will probably continue to um, change, and hopefully with the new data, with like the broadband map and new networks coming online from the different broadband funding programs out there, maybe we'll see a more accurate number from the FCC. But that's kind of what they have right now. They also say that 73% of the people who do have internet have a speed of 120, 100 down and 20 up. That just seems really, I think that's maybe the most inaccurate part of that data, because just judging from my experience of internet speeds on the Navajo Nation, finding a download speed of 100 megabits down is really tough. I don't know if there are a lot of communities that have that. A lot of the time you're looking at a speed of more like the 25.3 speed. They also say that 73% of the people in tribal areas have access to a physical broadband connection. So this is like a fiber optic or a cable hookup to a house. That one seems like it might be more true depending on, I guess, how a lot of this data that the FCC has provided is provided to them from the providers. So I think maybe because of that, the providers are saying, this is all of our physical connections. But I know for the Navajo Nation, a majority of the access is not from a physical wire to a house. A lot of it is wireless. Then also they say that out of the people on tribal lands that were identified in the census, 46% of those people have a subscription to home internet service. And again, we kind of compare this to our own survey of just like what we found in our pre-COVID survey. Um, but it's kind of, we were primarily looking at like how people use the internet at that time. But in 2019, we found that the primary way that people access the internet was through their phones, and they it was their sole point of access, so they relied on their phone service for that. And then only 36% had a phone company that provided internet to their house, and then only 12% said that they had a cable company for home internet access. And the way that we collected this data was we did a survey with a few of the Native American events here at ASU, and as well as traveled out to other um, public events. I believe I wasn't at AIPI in 2019, but they did travel out to some big events such as like in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe Indian Market, which has a huge draw. So they did a survey there and talked to people about their home internet access. So looking at internet speeds here in Arizona with some Arizona tribes, this is from broadbandmapping.com. Broadbandmapping.com is a website that kind of collects people who do internet speed tests using that site and publishes data on what the results of these speed tests are in certain areas. So it's a pretty it's a cool tool that I like to use. It kind of depends on crowdsourcing and people using it, but just this is some of their initial data on speed tests from tribal communities. Um, in Arizona, the average speed is about 102.14 with a 21 millisecond latency, which is pretty good. That's, I mean, for everywhere else in the state, you know, that includes the urban areas and big communities like Phoenix and Tucson. But for tribal communities, you see like Navajo Nation has really low numbers. It's only got 11.1 average speed with a huge latency of 91 milliseconds. Same for the Hopi tribe, which is in the same area of the state, which has 1511 and again a big latency of 87. Um, but you have the tribes that are around the urban areas who have better internet access. Salt River has, you know, the broadband mapping is showing that the average speed out of Salt River is actually pretty good. 165 down, 23 up, with a pretty short latency. And Tono Odom at the southern part of the state has also pretty decent access too. So it kind of varies here in Arizona. Um, but for a lot of it, I mean, if you go by like the new definition of broadband, which is the new speed is 100 down, 100 down download speed, like on this list only one tribe meets that standard. So obviously there's still a lot of work to continue to improve the quality of access that we're seeing, and especially for latency. Latency is a really important metric now because of all the live applications we use like Zoom and like live streaming. So although you have like a good download speed, that latency can still be an issue for a lot of the rural communities. So besides just access in general, the other barriers to um, digital equity in Indian country is, of course, affordability. That's the same for a lot of other communities as well. And this is coming from the most recent FCC Section 706 report, where they kind of give an update on broadband deployment and information from ISPs. Um, this is the data for the mountain region, which includes Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, kind of the area where I'm situated in the Southwest. And so in this region of the country, we're seeing these are the costs of internet. For fixed, the average cost seems to be about $55, um, which makes sense because, you know, a fixed cost is the cost for a connection to a house where you could have multiple people living. But where you see a lot of the high costs is in mobile. So cell phone plans, data plans. You know, for four people, data plans, average cost of $152 a month. Um, that's a pretty significant cost, especially if you're talking about people are who have a lower income. The FCC report uses a 200% of the federal poverty line, So they are listing these average incomes here. So if you look at a household size of maybe 3 or 4 people, they're saying that that average income is about 4,000. And with the high internet costs for mobile, that's coming in at like 2% of their income, 3% of their income, which is significant for people who don't have a lot of income. And then if you're talking about people who have both mobile and fixed internet and what they're paying, I mean, it's getting up to like 4.1% of their total income coming in every month. And if you're in a position where it's hard to make ends meet, I mean, it's, people start to um, go without broadband, internet access. And going without internet access, um, it's something that is needed these days. You need it to participate in a lot of different things, education, healthcare. So it hurts to cut it out. But um, this is kind of the cost in this region. So still need to do work on affordability. And since, from our findings in 2019 at AIPI, we determined that a lot of people use phones to access the internet. Um, these high costs of phone plans is continuing to be just a huge burden for just internet access in general. Then another barrier for a lot of tribal communities is just capacity, and I think this is true everywhere else. Um, if you're talking about, say, like digital equity work, right? Digital navigators, people to go out and talk to the community. I used to work for the Navajo Nation government, and this is the numbers that I gathered from the Navajo Nation government websites. Just the Navajo Nation government alone, right? The government entity. It's got 10 divisions, 10 departments of the government. There's about 2 to 4,000 employees in the Navajo Nation government. The Navajo Nation government is responsible for 110 community centers that are situated throughout the reservation. And then on top of those community centers, they've also got their main government buildings in the capital, Window Rock, Arizona, which is probably another couple dozen buildings. Just that alone, there's only 17 IT employees that cover that whole operation. 17 people oversee the website, they oversee the data centers, they oversee the network, and then they also do, help desk kind of work. Um, so I don't know how much time the IT department spends on digital equity or educating people. I mean, just educating employees alone is going to be a lot of work, but imagine the work that also is added when you talk about educating the community. Um, there's obviously got to be more capacity at every part of the of digital infrastructure, from people to run the networks, to build the networks, and then to help educate the community about how to use the networks. So that's kind of what a lot of tribal communities, just need a lot more expertise that's currently available. And these are a few photos from the Navajo Nation, and kind of representative of what a lot of the community looks like. You have houses in just really remote areas. Like this house is getting power for the first time. This photo was from an article that was talking about community members who were getting electricity for the first time. So, and this was right after COVID. I think it was from 2022. So I mean, you've got remote houses. You have there's I don't see like a telephone line pedestal. I only see one wire coming into the house, so there's no fiber coming into the house. Like, there's a lot of challenges with this kind of community situation that you've got, like just really remote. Again, here's another couple houses that are the same. These are houses kind of going up. It looks like one is still under construction right there, but there's no power line. There's no power line. There's no road. I mean, there's probably just like a Jeep trail going to these houses. So it's really hard to add internet to the other needs that a lot of these community members need. But I mean, that shouldn't exclude them. They still need internet, but this kind of just gives you an idea of what that challenge looks like on Navajo Nation at least. So yeah, that's just a quick interview or a quick introduction to what internet and digital equity looks like for tribal communities. Um, there are 574 tribal communities. Every community is different. So I just wanted to kind of show you what my experience was on Navajo Nation. But there is a need in every community, but it does look a little different from community to community. So yeah, I'll be happy to take any questions. I'll go ahead and give it back to Davida.
Awesome. Thank you, EJ. I would tell everyone to clap, but silent clap will do. That was amazing. That was really good to hear. Some really great content that was new to me, as well as just, really informative of the work we do. And actually, the first question is, which I probably should have asked you this and do my due diligence as a host, but people are interested in the slide, specifically the broadband and digital equity funding with all the great links there. So I don't know if you're willing to share them.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share that with you, and then you can get it out to the people.
Perfect. Yes. I mean, I do have a copy, so I'll send it out to everyone, but just wanted to ask, and sorry to ask you on camera. But yeah, so if we have any other questions there, in terms of, I know people want the slide, so that answers that. Did anyone have any other questions? If not, I have a lot. Well, people are typing their question, right? I just have a couple of them. So I know you kind of covered, the in terms of the historic and broadband barriers as a nation, and a little bit about what individual barriers we do in terms of like homes and households and things like that. I guess what does the average individual, I guess on Navajo, what is still preventing them from, fully engaging online?
um, so besides just access and maybe like the availability of internet, not just access but like devices too is a big issue. You people will use devices at home and at work, but if you don't have the internet connection at home, it's like, well, I mean, they'll have devices that school and work, but when they come back home, it's like, well, I don't need a computer at home because I don't have internet. Like, what am I going to do with it? That's one issue. Another issue is just kind of like since you didn't have the internet for so long, it's really hard to kind of explain to people. Like in my home community, it's hard to explain to people like why they should use internet and how it can benefit them, because they've just had it. They just live without it for so long, and they're able to work. At least with Navajo Nation government, largely, you can do stuff without internet, but internet makes it a lot easier. And so a lot of just a lack of education, a lack of like knowing what's possible through online access is a big barrier to just showing people that like, hey, there's this whole world out there that you can be a part of. You don't have to be the most technical, internet knowledgeable kind of a person, but you start by just being like, hey, do you want to email, your grandkids? Do you want to call or FaceTime family members? This is internet makes that possible.
Absolutely. Convincing my auntie that you can do all your online banking by never leaving your house, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and online banking is a big one because there's not a lot of banks in the Navajo Nation, and I remember I used to work in Windrock, and I remember like the one ATM in Windrock went down for like a day, and people were like panicking. So um, it helps if you can online bank and you don't have to worry about having to go drive hours to the nearest bank or to the nearest town that has your financial institution in it.
We have a couple questions. So Alonzo Melendez, excuse me, says, I'm grateful for this presentation. Thank you. I wonder if there is any data around the impact of the lack of digital inclusion/equity on tribal lands plays on the professional development of those that seek work away from their tribal lands.
Um, Not specifically like data showing that outcome, but I mean you can kind of piece it together if you look at workforce data, if you look at education data. You can try and piece that together, but there's not a lot of like specific studies about like the impacts of internet access or the impacts of the lack of internet access. That's not available yet.
Mhm. I was just on a webinar yesterday and they said that like they didn't see it, they didn't see it out there in terms of impacting the workforce and training that they needed to do. They weren't sure. So they just started to survey their own citizens and their tribal employees to figure it out. So creating your own data, right, is probably the best and most accurate.
Yeah, that definitely is the best way to go. That's one thing I kind of forgot to mention, but tribes, because they have to do all of this on their own a lot of the time, a lot of them have been innovative. They do their own surveys. Here at Gila River, Digital Connect is a really good entity on getting feedback from their community. They go out there, they do the education, but they also collect data, they do surveys, and they try to get the most accurate representation of what the digital equity need is there. So tribal communities, the ones who are kind of taking that initiative are producing some really great work.
Nice. So you mentioned Digital Connect. I'm just going to put their website in the chat. But one a really great example of folks doing digital inclusion work for their tribe, and it's based in Gila River, or part of Gila River. There's another question. So I live in, sorry, I'm going to butcher this, Nenana, Alaska. Is there a way to partner with anyone or tribe to carry out the program? The need is here, and I can help because I live in rural Alaska. I also need the digital equity, but I have skills that can be used anywhere. And that's from Leona. Oh,
So
Leonardo. Sorry.
yeah,
It's from
so
Leonardo. Just want to correct that. Go ahead.
yeah, so for that, I would think that like for digital equity, I mean, national, your organization, NDIA, would be a good place to start to look at where some resources might be available. Um, we've seen some really great work coming out of regional tribal organizations. So up in the Northwest, there is an organization called AT&I. I don't remember the acronym exactly, but AT&I, they are an organization of tribes located in that area, and they do a lot of work to address issues like infrastructure development, but they also do stuff like broadband, and they try to connect each other with resources that might be available to them. You see that also in like parts of California where there are a lot of tribal areas. So if you have like a regional tribal consortium that you know about, they might be able to help. They might have some resources available to you as well. But also just reaching out to people around other tribes around you is also a good place to start, because a lot of people share that information that they might have available to them, and you never know unless you ask. So yeah, it's I don't know any off the top of my head for Alaska, but that's where I would start.
I mean, I would probably, there's some regional, some folks who work on a lot of corporations like Alaska Federation of Natives and others. But that's like the main one that I know of. So, yes. Let's see. So another one from Ilana Lowry. So what are the biggest concerns around trust and safety with regard to using the internet?
I think in my home community, we had this discussion right after COVID, because we were going to get access to wireless internet for the first time. And a lot of the community members in my home area were talking about, they had concerns about people, hacking into their bank accounts. They had concerns about social media and staying safe on social media for their kids and grandkids, making sure that content was like safe and not detrimental. They also had concerns about devices, about like people were wanting to know if it was possible for people to like start um, like hacking into their webcams, and people were asking about their vehicles, because they said I remember my car has Wi-Fi, like is my car going to be safe and stuff like that. So there was like a lot of questions along those lines. And then from the Navajo kind of government level and administration level, there was big concern. There are still concerns about data protection and data sovereignty, to make sure that data that the Navajo Nation deems as sensitive data doesn't get out to public and public viewing, especially when you talk about like AI aggregators. If somebody at a Navajo Nation office is using an AI to like fill out a form or to craft like a grant proposal, and they're entering in information to that AI, I mean, that information goes out to the public. So From an administrative level, the tribes are also figuring out how to make sure they keep the data safe with this new level of internet access.
Nice, thanks for that. I know someone tried to raise their hand, but since it's a webinar, I'm hopeful you can actually use the Q&A function to ask your question. So apologize for that, but we still love to hear from you. So I have a couple questions in the queue. So let's see. Cindy Hogan says, through the last few years, has this digital inclusion movement been respectful of digital data sovereignty? It's a really good question.
I think for the so I mainly focus on like the infrastructure part of digital equity, digital inclusion, just getting connections out to people in the first place. In the infrastructure part of it, it hasn't been super respectful of data sovereignty because, especially like for mapping projects, or if you're wanting data on broadband serviceable locations, you're asking tribes to give you information about their land and what's located within their reservations. And for tribal communities, there's a lot of sensitive areas, geographic areas like sacred sites, or maybe there are natural resources like water, like rivers and streams and lakes and stuff that they don't want necessarily super knowledgeable, like public knowledge out there for. I mean, Google Maps is probably going to show it, but they don't want to provide more information about like how to access it or anything like that. So tribes that want to protect some of that information, there are still some hiccups between working with broadband companies or with the state or with the federal government who are asking for that data to start these projects. But at the same time, tribes, they want to protect some of that data too. So there still needs to be some work to figure out, how do we move forward and make sure that tribal interests are protected, but we also get the information that we need to build a fiber, line, or whatever it is. So yeah, on the infrastructure side, there still needs to be work done. For work within the communities, I would say that kind of effort is probably needs. It's not necessarily like data sovereignty protection considerations. It's more of just like working with tribal community considerations. So making sure that you respect the community that you're going into if you're going to do digital inclusion work. Be respectful of what the tribe asks you to do and what they don't ask of you. Just making sure that you're not setting the agenda and you're not dictating to a tribe what you want them to do or what you want that community to do. It's more like just meeting them where they are, working with them and understanding what their needs are and trying to meet those needs that they're asking about.
Thanks, CJ. So we have a couple questions and only 3 minutes left. Sorry. The next question is, are there any creative solutions, programs that are provided in urban areas to support tribal lands that can be replicated? And can I answer that one real quick? Or you can give your comments, but we have this program that actually is hopeful to solve that, to like provide solutions and programs and best practices for specific to serving Native communities. It's called 7-Star Communities. And we have an announcement tomorrow at the community call. So if you want to hear more about that, tune into our community call. But also visit the website tomorrow, not today, to hear more about the updates about what that is. But EJ, if you have any comments about that, would be great.
No, that's a great example. The biggest benefit that we saw for Native Americans living in urban areas was the ACP program, because that addressed the affordability barrier, the biggest barrier. So anything that helps people subsidize that cost would be the most beneficial.
Nice. Maybe one more question. When conducting broadband mapping efforts, how can we be more respectful with tribal nations?
So I think a big part of it is you have to take the time to actually go out and talk with tribes and talk about what information you're wanting to represent on a map. Because there's a lot of, you got to set expectations with tribal communities. Tribes don't necessarily want to lock down all information, but they want to make sure that they know what's going to happen with the information, like where it's going, where it's going to be stored, how is it going to be used, who's going to be looking at it. So if you are asking a tribal community to provide some of that information to you, you have to make sure that you're super transparent about all of that that's going on. And the tribe may say no. So if the tribe says no, then that's the determination. So you just got to take the time to make sure that those expectations are set and that you do your due diligence in that communication.
Nice, thank you. Amazing questions, and thank you, Gina. She actually pointed out that we have if you go to our affiliate list on digitalinclusion.org, NDI's website, You can see other affiliates in your state or in your community that you can reach out to if you're questioning like who else is doing this work or possibly partnering with tribes, or maybe ask them if they're partnering with tribes too. But you can find that in the link that she provided. So thank you, EJ. This was great. Happy Native American Heritage Month too. So it's good to see everyone. Hopefully we see more folks at Net Inclusions being hosted at a Gila River Indian community, which is awesome. So thanks all. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.